opera and politics in the French Enlightenment. And my work intersects really well with the things that Opera Lafayette does, and I'm always so happy to collaborate with them. Jace was nice enough to give a plug for my book, The Comedians of the King, Opera Comique, and the Bourbon Monarchy on the Eve of Revolution. And I bring this in not entirely as a shameless plug, because there's something about this title that leads us into our talk today. So I called it The Comedians of the King, because that is a play, that title is a play on the way the performers of the genre identified themselves. So these performers called themselves the comédiens ordinaires du roi, or the official actors of the king. But in this chronicle of comic opera at the Bourbon court, my editors and I had this huge back and forth about this particular title, because the main king in this study, Louis XVI, really didn't care very much about opera at all, as we'll get into. So we were almost going to call this book The Comedians of the Queen, acknowledging Marie Antoinette's huge impact on French music in the waning old regime. So this presentation is great because it offers me something of a redo. Last week, if you joined us, or even if you didn't, we spoke about Marie Antoinette as a tastemaker in broad terms, in fashion, in architecture, in landscape design, and the like. Today, we zoom in. We're going to think about Marie Antoinette as a musical tastemaker. So what kinds of music did she patronize, and what were the political implications of that patronage? The structure of our discussion is as follows. I'm going to begin with a brief historical introduction to music at the Bourbon court, and this is a bit of review for those of us who were here last week. Then I'm going to focus in turn on three spheres of Marie Antoinette's influence: her training and private musical performances, her support for courtly opera, and then her interventions into the Parisian marketplace, into institutions for music making in Paris. In each of these sections, I'm going to provide a brief teaser for a corresponding event in Opera Lafayette's June Festival. So I'm going to move through thinking about music in Marie Antoinette's Salon, thinking about Marie Antoinette's patronage of Grétry's Sylvain, and then finally thinking about the concert spirituel and its transatlantic journeys, which corresponds with the final program on this festival. So in sum, I'd like you to come out of this hour or so knowing more about Marie Antoinette's musical life, and also knowing how the various concerts in Opera Lafayette's festival reflect those varied musical endeavors. And I would say last week we were more presentation and then questions. This week, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any point. It's been a couple months, thank goodness, since I've taught on Zoom, but I do have the chat and the participation windows open. So if you'd like to use the raise hand function or put something into the chat, I'm happy to entertain that, have a little bit of discussion, have our videos on as the hour progresses. We'll also reserve 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end. So let's jump in. Few repertories of Western art music have been more persistently identified with absolutist politics than the tragic operas and courtly ballets of Louis XIV's Versailles. The most famous examples of this genre by Jean-Baptiste Lully have been described by one historian as veritable symbols of musical Bourbonism. And another historian describes these rather more colloquially as the courtiest court operas that ever were. And this was a focus of some of our talks last week. Professor Weber discussed the relationship between the taste-making Louis XIV and his favored composer, Lully. And we might add that Lully's operas serve as a sort of sonic equivalent to the building design or the landscape architecture at the Palace of Versailles. What I mean by that is that this music is beautifully opulent as well as rigidly formalized. It expresses a constant tension between rationality and pleasure. For example, here's a grand Passacaglia from Lully's Armide, an opera associated with the Sun King from 1686. And the underlying structure here is rigid. This has a strictly repeating bass line over and over again. You can listen to that in this little extract. descending tetrachord bass. Beautiful diagram done by one of my old mentors, James Hepikowski here. Sorry, I skipped a slide. But that facade, so we have this rigid repeating bass line. The facade itself is lavishly ornamented, a series of increasingly elaborate melodic variations. So this time you can listen to the melody on top of that facade. The repeat of the A section. New variation. Repeat it again. So I don't need to dwell on that, but I just want to think about the ways that this combination of hypnotic melody and architectural musical structure reflect this dialectic of extravagance and control that defined the cultural life of Louis XIV's court writ large. Now, historians have often traced a narrative of decline from this apex of French royal musical patronage. And not without reason, quite frankly. The kings that followed the Roi Soleil possessed neither his passion for music nor his savvy at exploiting its political potential. They abdicated their role as tastemakers, to borrow a turn of phrase that Professor Weber was using last week. So Louis XV was personally fond of opera, but far less active as a patron than either his wife, the Queen Maria Leczinska, or his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who's going to be the subject of an entirely separate festival next year by Opera Lafayette. Louis XVI is even more apathetic towards this art form, so much so apparently that it makes the news. It literally makes the news when he didn't fall asleep during an evening at the theater, because taking a nap in this case is the default. When Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770, officials feared that she shared her new husband's decisive aversion to music. And decisive aversion is an actual quote from a government document. For her wedding, she's treated to a retrospective of the greatest operatic hits of the previous century, and it's headlined by a lavish revival of an opera by Lully, who we just listened to. It's an opera called Versailles. The Royal Opera at Versailles, the Opera Hall at Versailles, is actually inaugurated for this particular occasion. To the huge alarm of the people who are organizing these spectacles, she reacts with utter indifference. The head of court spectacles writes, quote, that the program had been rather too serious for Marie Antoinette, given that she seemed not to like music, end quote. But it quickly becomes apparent that these official anxieties are quite misguided. So true, this Habsburg Archduchess is openly skeptical of la musique ancienne, the old music, the aging ceremonial repertory that had been created in the reign of Louis XIV. However, this is not because she does not like music writ large. Rather, it's because her tastes are more modern, more sophisticated, more international than those that then prevail amongst the French royal family. In the years that followed, Marie Antoinette would emerge as a performer and patron of expansive political cultural vision. And as we'll discuss, as we'll see, her influence would revolutionize aesthetics and programming at Versailles, with repercussions that will reverberate in Paris, in Francophile courts throughout Europe, and in the distant reaches of the French colonial empire. So Opera Lafayette's festival, the Era of Marie Antoinette Rediscovered, which is running in early June, is very interesting because it's offering correctives to several ingrained but not quite correct assumptions about music in the French Enlightenment. So on the one hand, it is situating or trying to situate this repertory in a broader global context. And it's also on the other reframing gendered narratives that have been really focused on kingly patronage. So let's dive in. Marie Antoinette's artistic predilections are shaped in her childhood in Austria. So the Habsburg family is an exceptionally musical one. Marie Antoinette's mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, is a gifted singer and dancer, and she took great care with the musical education of her children. Marie Antoinette had her first documented musical performance at the age of 4. Interestingly, what she sings or what she performs is a French popular song of vaudeville for the celebrations marking the name day of her father, the Emperor Francis I, and that's in 1759. He loved French culture. He liked for her to sing French songs. By the age of 6, Marie Antoinette has met Mozart, who came to play for her mother at their palace at Schönbrunn. The Princess and the Prodigy are exact contemporaries. She's born late 1755. He's born early 1756. One of the anecdotes goes that she developed a childhood crush on Mozart, and how different would both music history and history have been had that gone anywhere. Shortly after she meets Mozart, she takes up her own instrumental lesson. She favors the keyboard. She also favors the harp. And alongside her siblings, she's given instruction in figured bass and in rudimentary composition. She studies with Johann Adolf Hasse, who's an opera composer, Georg Christoph Wagenseil, who is more known as instrumental music, and most famously probably Christoph Willibald Gluck, who's known for his reform operas. He wrote, for example, a very famous setting of Orfeo e Euridice. Musical performance would be a lifelong pleasure for Marie Antoinette, and she resumed this training shortly after her arrival at Versailles. Her letters suggest that she spent probably an hour or more every afternoon to lessons and practice, and she would keep up that routine on and off for the duration of her reign. Here's a receipt from the archives for her harp lessons. And this is a composer, her harp teacher, Philip Joseph Hinner, is a composer who's featured on these Opera Lafayette concerts. At one point, she even pays for her teacher. She pays for Hinner to take his own trip to Italy to take harp lessons so that he could come back to France and teach her all the more effectively. I mean, you can imagine this really annoys the people who are in charge of her budget. Music making is not simply a solitary activity, but it's a real vital form of diversion for the members of Marie Antoinette's very elite social circle. As queen, she would sponsor small-scale concerts in her private apartments several times each week, or upwards of 150 times each year. I have spent about a decade, I would say, rifling through Marie Antoinette's receipts. It's the main thing I do, looking at these receipts in the archives of the French royal household. And I would say that in these boxes and boxes of documents emerge, well, many things emerge, but I would say 2 really key themes emerge about the Queen's approach to music making and about her musical preferences. So the first thing that we learn from these archives is that the Queen's musical tastes were voracious, and that they were quite international and forward-looking, or especially forward-looking in comparison to what was then popular at court, this musique ancienne, old traditional courtly fare. So every month she would add dozens and dozens of scores to her music library, and these skewed towards arias or arrangements of arias from the very latest comic operas. And that was often Italian comic operas, or it was French opera comique, like the works that Opera Lafayette performs. Just some of the titles you can see here. This is just a random month I picked out. This is April 1784. They've copied arias from an opera comique called Tom Jones. You might know that as a famous English novel from around the same time. Zenire Azor, which is a relatively well-known opera by Gray Tree, her personal director of music, or here's some Gluck down at the bottom, Ephigenia in Taurus. These genres represent the vanguard of modern cosmopolitan music in the late 18th century in Europe. The second thing I noticed in going through her records is that, contrary to her reputation for frivolity in other domains, the evidence suggests that Marie Antoinette pursued these musical endeavors quite earnestly. After the births of each of her children, for example, she requested that a stage be built in her private apartments so that comedies and operas could continue unabated as she convalesced. I like to joke it's like a really fancy Netflix. The all-encompassing nature of this engagement is probably best demonstrated in the rehearsal and scheduling of the famous, or perhaps the infamous, Troupe des Seigneurs. This is an amateur, or what's known as a society troupe, a company that Marie Antoinette forms with some of her close associates, as pictured on this slide, to mount spoken and lyric comedies in her private theater at the Château du Petit Trianon. That opening slide is a picture of her theater. We can talk about this discrepancy between this hugely gilded frame and this very rustic set. This is a set for the king and the farmer, le roi et le fermier, and the political implications thereof. But what is also interesting is that the society troupe prepares its performances very extensively. I've found payment records for the royal instrument porters, who are the people who have to set up her rehearsals. And what we see in these documents is that she's receiving coaching from quite famous professional actors and composers, and that she's preparing fairly seriously. She takes up to 5 days of rehearsal before the presentation of each. So this is just my transcription of a busy month in the summer of 1780, where you see she might have 5 days of daily rehearsal and then a performance. Then she might send her porter to purchase more scores in Paris, then resuming more rehearsals and the like. Her minder, whose name is the Count of Merci Argenteau, who's supposed to report on her activities to her mother, Maria Theresa in Vienna, writes around this time that musical theater had become the single and unique obsession of the Queen. And he doesn't seem to be exaggerating too much in this case. Here we have, just to give you a sense of this soundscape, this is an aria that the Queen would have performed in one of those operatic performances. So this is a recording by Opera Lafayette of an opera called The Roi et le Fermier, The King and the Farmer. She portrayed a shepherdess named Jenny, and this would have been one of the arias she would have sung. Opera Lafayette's concert, the musical Salon of Marie Antoinette, which is curated by a harpist named Sandrine Chatron, provides a rare window into this soundscape of aristocratic leisure. So this concert will foreground genres in vogue with 18th century musical amateurs like the Queen. So it features chamber arrangements of opera arias, like the one that we just heard. It also features small-scale chamber works for various solo instruments and groups of instruments called sonatas. And then it also features, finally, elegant popular songs, strophic popular songs known as romans. So here's just a taste. This is, I'm going to exit this so I can see my buttons. This is a sonata for flute and harp by a composer who often worked in her private soirees, Joseph Bologna, Chevalier de Saint-Georges. There's perhaps a more famous piece for flute and harp, a concerto for flute and harp by Mozart, written right around the same time for the same sort of society of enthusiastic amateur musicians, flute and harp being very popular aristocratic amateur instruments at that time. Here's another example. This is a popular song by a composer named Martini, also very close to the Queen, called Plaisir d'amour. I think this is the finale of the concert. There are some melodic similarities to Elvis's Can't Help without falling in love with you. That seems coincidental, but maybe someone will have more historical background on that. To stop it on the not perfect cadence, but we could talk a little bit more. This is a really vivid window into this elegant aristocratic landscape. I should say this program is also quite interesting in the way that it casts spotlights on artists with personal connections to the Queen. So we'll hear music by Mozart, for example, who she knew from childhood. We'll hear music from her teachers, Gluck and the harpist Hinner. And then we'll also hear music from instrumental virtuosos who she was known to have sponsored or who performed at her private soirees, people like Dussek, who's a famous pianist at the time, and Saint-Georges as well. I should note that although this repertory was performed by and for elite audiences, we shouldn't think of it as insular. Taken together, this program underscores the internationalization of the French court repertory in the late Old Regime. So during this time, the French court is drawing talent from across Europe, from across the French Atlantic world. Actually, of the 12 composers who are featured on this concert, only 2 were born in metropolitan France. And so as Marie Antoinette is drawing international artists to the French court, she's also sending this music outwards. The repertory favored at Versailles circulates extensively in print, which is aided by new technologies of music engraving and a corresponding expansion in commerce of music for domestic use. So this is a way that this aristocratic music can travel. When Mozart first comes to Paris as a child of 6-7 years old, he immediately starts publishing music for this aristocratic sphere. Also, just because this is a sort of a cycle on the patronage of women, I would note that many of these music engravers were also women. It was a profession associated with women in the 18th century. And as I said, I'm moving on to my next section. I have sort of 10 minutes for each section allotted. But if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat or raise your hand or think of them now and we can get to them at the end. So Marie Antoinette's fondness for music was established during her childhood, as we've seen, and it's reinforced by her extensive activities as an amateur performer. But from her very first months in France, these private preferences also influenced the public theatrical calendar at court. So those are the ceremonial productions that are offered at the palaces of Versailles and Fontainebleau by France's 3 crown-supported theaters. So those are the Opéra, sometimes known as the Académie Royale de Musique, which produces tragic operas, the Comédie Française, which produces spoken tragedy and comedy, and then the Comédie Italienne, which is largely known for dialogue opera or opéra comique. So after the disastrous reception of the royal wedding festivities in 1770, the balance of entertainments at the court is radically altered. So Louis XV is convinced to add more light comedies to the schedule for the sole reason that it is suggested to him that this would be agreeable to the Dauphin. And that's another quote from a government document. After the accession of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette takes an even more active role in shaping the operatic productions of the court. Her husband doesn't have any interest in this, and so it's she who begins to submit suggestions for repertory or to make adjustments to various programs. There is a poor, beleaguered intendant of court spectacles in this period whose name is Papillon de la Ferté, and by 1877, she's clearly, 1777, excuse me, she's just clearly in charge. As he writes, the trip to Fontainebleau will take place. The Queen chose the spectacles as she desired. An analysis of the works that are staged in this period reveals a broad development in this court repertory and a striking movement towards latest composition. So first, as we can see, The output of lyric tragedy is radically updated during these years. So this graphic displays the most popular court composers of tragic operas between 1770 and 1789. The number of performances is on the y-axis, and then the gray bars denote composers who are alive when Marie Antoinette arrives in France. The red bars are those who were deceased, or representations of those very old tragedies that I mentioned at the top of this presentation. So you'll notice here, there are not a lot of performances of tragédie lyrique at all. There's no more than 8 by any single composer. And those performances that are given are largely dedicated to recent works. So this repertory is dominated by what we might call reform tragedies by a generation of international composers who are favored by the Queen. So that's people like Gluck, her teacher, and Italian composers like Piccini and Sacchini. And you'll notice also that the 2-episode, or sort of the 2-performance run of the very old Lully opera Percé that Marie Antoinette saw at her wedding seems to have made a very strong impression, though exactly the opposite impression that that officials had intended. So that's the first. So we have 2 performances of Lully over here. That's the first and the last time that she will ever see a Lully opera at Versailles. It's like no more of that. I'll play you just a snippet of one of Gluck's operas for the court. Get a nice survey of recordings by Opera Lafayette here. Even more dramatic than these changes in repertory of tragic operas at court is a shift in the overall distribution of musical genres in favor at the royal residences. So indeed, there's a lot of scholarly attention about Marie Antoinette and Gluck, and that's legitimate, but he is nowhere near the very top tier of her favored composers, or most frequently staged composers at Versailles. And the most successful court composers of the 1770s, 1780s are all the established stars of comic opera, or opera comique. And that's led by the Queen's personal director of music, Grétry, and followed by people like Monsigny, Duny, Philidor, less famous today, but exactly the people that Opera Lafayette performs. So you'll notice that this chart of total repertory contains a far larger number of performances. And gray bars here are denoting performances of comic opera, red bars, performances of tragic opera. And so by far, the most popular court composer at this time is Grétry. In fact, I have a snippet for you of the most popular work of the most popular composer at the French court. So we might say this is an alternative contender for courtiest court opera. And this is a work called L'Amant Jaloux, or The Jealous Lover, from 1778. This is a Figaro-esque farce. At this point, the characters are hiding various people in closets to escape the ire of that eponymous jealous lover.
Il est jaloux, mais très jaloux. Il est jaloux, il est jaloux. Ah, 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 que les jaloux sont fous. Scotez mon agile, il faut comprendre la passerelle. Rien ne me retiendra, la fidèle, la pargile, la voilà. Au ciel, c'est une femme.
It's very Mozartian, and actually Mozart was in Paris when this particular opera was premiered. We discussed last week how Marie Antoinette's tastes are a reaction against those regimented artistic standards that had previously prevailed at Versailles, and that's quite apparent here. This prominence of comedy on court stages is perceived as a big threat to the theatrical status quo. So though opera comique is now performed by one of these royal theaters, the Comédie Italienne, the genre actually has fairground roots. Sorry, that slide is taking a minute to come into focus, originating at the fairground theaters of the French capital. And the genre also tends to feature lower class characters and a more accessible musical language that contrasted quite sharply with the mythological settings, with the elevated idiom of French court tragedy. So it is quite a different sound. The centerpiece of Opera Lafayette's festival is the modern premiere of another opera comique by Grétry, probably the second or third most popular comedy at the court. And I would have loved to play you an extract, but it doesn't exist yet on recording, and so we need Opera Lafayette to record it. This work is called Sylvain, and it embodies the forward-looking lyric aesthetic of Marie Antoinette's Versailles. This work is a real parable of enlightened thought, an attack on aristocratic privilege. Basically, the title character has been estranged from his noble relatives and living in the countryside after an unsuitable marriage, and his benevolent father intervenes, having been convinced that, as he says, simple virtue holds more weight than birth. This progressive message might seem very out of place at the center of French absolutism, but it was meant to project, whether ingenuously or not, the modernizing outlook of the regime, as well as the Queen's openness to fashionable new ideals of the philosophe. If this defines the court style, we should also say that this work, and opera comique more generally, also comes to define the sound of French music outside of metropolitan France. So again, Marie Antoinette is bringing artists to Versailles, and then she's sending this music outwards. Sylvain is documented, disseminated widely. It is produced in Amsterdam, Brussels, Frankfurt, Vienna, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Stockholm, Copenhagen, and that's just to name a few. And those are just the European performances. It is also performed in Cap Français, Port-au-Prince, and New Orleans. So Marriage of Figaro is later in the 1780s, indeed. Sorry, I'm seeing questions coming in the chat. And Mozart's setting is 1786. Comic operas like Sylvain were readily exportable. They are modest in scale and economically efficient to reproduce. They are also structured with spoken dialogue rather than recitative, which means that they are easier to translate. Before the end of the century, Sylvain is reworked in Danish, Dutch, German, Russian, and Swedish, and those are the ones that I have found. So this theatrical repertory is very interesting. It is promulgating Marie Antoinette as a paragon of enlightened values on this vast European stage. It's simultaneously, of course, exposing the huge hypocrisies of those values in the profoundly inegalitarian context of the French colonial empire. And we have scholars on this subject, Laurent Dubois and Kayama Glover, who are writing very eloquently about those tensions in an essay I've just seen that's going to go into a program book that's distributed with the performances. So it's very interesting how all of these questions of cultural transfer of this music will be brought to the fore in this particular festival from Opera Lafayette. So the Crown-affiliated institutions, these dramatic institutions of the old regime, have a dual identity. So I've already discussed that these actors are responsible for performing at the Bourbon court, but they're primarily based in the capital, and they are granted a relative degree of autonomy in their internal governance and in the repertory decisions of their Parisian theaters. So you may well know the Parisian site of the Opéra that still exists today, though it's a new building. The Comédie Italienne is still situated on the spot where it was in the 1780s. Much more than her Bourbon predecessors, I would say, Marie Antoinette expressed an interest in these companies' inner workings and a willingness to intervene in their public offerings. There's a musicologist named Patrick Barbier who has a new book on Marie Antoinette, and he notes that visits by the royal family are very rare to these Parisian theaters in the years before 1770. They only really ventured to the theater in Paris for official ceremonial occasions. Marie Antoinette, by contrast, is a frequent and prominent presence at these spectacles. So she has annual box seats at all three of these royal theaters, and she's made, as far as we can count, more than 120 appearances at those spectacles between 1773 and 1787, when she stopped coming to the theater. It's also worth underscoring that as queen, she has the power to shape these performances to her liking. There are lots of memos in the archives of the royal household for couriers sent from Versailles to Paris to alter on very short notice the advertised schedule of these troops to accommodate whatever she wanted to see that evening. So here, for example, is a night in 1777 when she sends word to the Comédie Italienne, no, I don't want to hear La Servante Maîtresse, which is a translation of Pergolesi's Serva Petrona. I don't want to hear that tonight. What I really want to hear is my favorite, Grétry's Sylvain. The queen might also exert power over casting. The performances of the Parisian theaters, they often let there be casts, so the non-star players perform on Sundays, but there are also memos on days where the queen decides to come to the theater in Paris on a Sunday, and so they literally have to run to the houses of the stars, like put their costumes on them as they run to the theater, so that Marie Antoinette gets to see the star players that she prefers. The Queen's support for individual composers and musical works could ensure their success on Parisian stages. So she's said to have made it possible for Gluck to be such a star in Paris because she applauds for him, or Opéra Comique also hugely is granted a gain in status in these years because of the way that she patronizes them. But I want to talk just a little bit about other forms of music because she also had her hands in the other forms of music for which Paris was very famous. So if Paris is known as a center of operatic composition in the 18th century, it's also a locus of innovation in sacred and in instrumental music. And such works are programmed in new public concert series, the most famous of which is called the Concert Spirituel, and that's the most prestigious concert organization of the 18th century. It runs between 1725 and 1790. It performs, at least at the start, at the Tuileries Palace. As its moniker implies, the programming of the latter institution is originally focused on spiritual, on sacred repertory, but it subsequently evolves to include a rich variety of genres, symphonies, concertos, operatic extracts, alongside sacred works. So by the 1750s, an observer can say, I challenge anyone to say that a man becomes more devout in the least at leaving the Concert Spirituel, though I know well that one becomes a lover of Italian ariettes there. These Parisian concerts are really interesting because they have been taken to demonstrate the democratization of musical patronage and consumption in the old regime. They're run by individual entrepreneurs rather than royal sponsors, and they're relatively affordably priced, and they have dynamic and eclectic programming that's meant to appeal for broad audiences. So for example, we can see by zooming in on a concert poster, a ticket at the Concert Spirituel, the cheapest ticket costs 3 livres, which is not nothing, but for example, for comparison, Marie Antoinette is spending like 10,000 livres for her box seat yearly at the Comédie Italienne or the Opera. So it's putting music more broadly accessible to larger publics. We also see that this repertory goes quite eclectic, quite diverse by the end of the century. If we look, indeed, if we sort of zoom in on this concert program, this is a particular concert for a feast day, for the Feast of Assumption, and we do have some sacred music, a motet, for example, but lots of it is not, sort of an eclectic variety of things, symphonies, performance of a young virtuoso on the violin, symphonies of Italian performances of Italian arias, and the like. So many historians have read this as like a site of bourgeois musical struggle or place where, and this is a quote from a historian, Peter Schlunig, the rising middle classes tore down the barriers and fences which had reserved cultural goods for the feudal elite. But here again, I would say Marie Antoinette still has some influence. So she's appearing with some regularity at performances, she's sponsoring notable virtuosos, and she's developing enduring associations with certain works. For example, you might have heard of the Haydn Symphony that's known as La Reine. This is actually commissioned for another one of these competing series, but it is associated, she has a preference for it, and so it's given this nickname over time. I didn't actually mean to start that. I was going to say I've had so few Zoom-related errors, but we'll go to my last slide since I just have a couple minutes left. Opera Lafayette's third festival program, the Concert Spirituel aux Caraïbes, highlights the wide-ranging impact of these new forms of concert culture, as well as the manner they encapsulated both the hopeful possibilities and the stark limitations of speaking of an 18th century musical Enlightenment. So the commercial model of the Concert Spirituel sparked numerous imitators throughout Europe. It expands public access to art music in Leipzig, Stockholm, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Bordeaux, Vienna, many other cities. Indeed, this concert series, this concept for a series, proves so portable that it's also replicated in France's colonies in the Caribbean. And the transatlantic movement of French musicians and impresarios underscores the entanglements, both financial and artistic, between colonies and metropole in the waning old regime. And people like Pedro Memmelsdorf and André Peschek have written about this really beautifully recently. Opera Lafayette's concert, this final concert on the series, recreates a program, one of these transported programs that would have been performed on Christmas Day 1780 in Port-au-Prince in Saint-Domingue, mimicking the fashion in Paris. And we can see why this is so politically fraught and shows us how this meaning, or how this music acquired radically different meanings in different contexts. So these concerts within France, as we've seen, are seen as an embodiment of a progressive, non-hierarchical public sphere. In the French colonies, they're showing how music is reflecting and how it's being facilitated by these broader economic systems that are based upon colonial exploitation. And that's something that's going to come up in the programming that Pedro Memmelsdorf is doing for this concert as well. So Marie Antoinette's musical politics, this is a huge question, and I'm, in a sense, throwing the ball to Rebecca, who's going to be giving the talk, not immediately now, but she's giving us her talk next week, and she's thinking about Marie Antoinette's musical legacies, and she's going to tell us about how this music affects Marie Antoinette's reputation, and how this also inflects how music for women is interpreted going into the Napoleonic period. And then we'll certainly have more programming coming up, more online programming dealing with Sylvain, and then a whole host of talks about the Caribbean context, the colonial context for some of these pieces as we go into the run-up to the June concert week. So I hope this has given you an idea of what's happening in the festival. I'm going to stop my screen share now, though I might bring it up. I'd encourage you to put anything, any questions into the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hands and turn on your videos and engage with me directly, nothing like staring into a Zoom void. And I know we also have some great other historians here who are welcome to pitch in as well. Many people participating, so Judith Miller, Rebecca Jeffrey Schwinden, Callum Blackmore are all participating in the programming of this festival, so we have a good contingent. Could have played more music examples, not everyone at once. Susan, yeah, please.
How would new talents and new composers and anybody that Marie Antoinette didn't already know before she got to the court come to her attention? I mean, who were the people who would bring her news of new performers or composers that she might be interested in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how does someone who's isolated, in a sense, at Versailles get wind of all the latest trends in the capital? I would say most of this is happening through her extended social network. Or many of the people she's close with at court also have their own personal director of music. So for example, the Count of Artois, who's her brother-in-law, and the Countess of Artois are very avid musical patrons. And they will say, oh, I heard this opera, I had this soloist come and play at my house. And so we have this these extended networks, basically. There has been recent work by a historian named Hennebel that's about the sheer number of musicians who actually lived with French aristocrats in Paris in the 18th century. So you would, in essence, have your normal servants, and then you'd have, say, a small orchestra or a handful of musicians who would literally be living in your house. So there are these robust aristocratic networks of people who are sponsoring talent, and I would imagine that word gets around that way through these aristocratic circles. And indeed, she would start with nurturing talent of very young performers. So she prided herself on, say, having 6, 7, 8-year-old harp prodigies, piano prodigies come and play for her. Actually, I can plug this new book. It's in French, but there is a new book called Marie Antoinette et la musique, Patrick Barbier, and he talks a little bit about that patronage as well. It's a great question, Susan. Thanks. Yeah, Rebecca.
I was wondering, thanks. This is so fun. It feels very indulgent to get to just listen to someone talk about the research that I'm interested in. I was wondering if we know whether when these dialogue operas moved out to other cosmopolitan centers, if people there were associating them with Marie Antoinette, or if they were unaware of the power that she wielded in getting that repertory out there, or like what if we know of any evidence about that.
Yeah. So what are the political implications of her music outside of France? And this has been the subject of some new, very recent, interesting work looking at Sweden, looking at Scandinavia in particular. I would say in many cases, monarchs are trying to align themselves with French culture as a symbol of elite refinement. That said, as I've sort of alluded to just briefly, many of these operas are also so translatable because you can change their meanings, because the text, unlike a fully sung through opera, which has recitative, which is very hard to change the words, these just have long snippets of dialogue and then interspersed airs. So you could change the dialogue all you want to make it sort of about a different subject. So they could also be exploited for different political ends in different political contexts. And they meant something completely different in her childhood. In her childhood, French theater was very, very popular in Vienna, as Bruce Allen Brown has written about, and it obviously didn't have associations with her politics yet, because she hadn't made the transfer the other way. It's this big circular transfer of music throughout Europe. Yeah, great question. I see I have some questions in the chat. Is there any chance there will be a future series featuring Marie Therese? Napoleon so coveted her composer. Napoleon and music. So Rebecca is going to talk a little bit about Napoleon and music next week and how things change for musicians getting into the 19th century. So the next two, I will say that we're going backwards in time in this initial festival. So we're talking about Marie Antoinette in this year's festival. Next spring, the festival will be about the Marquise de Pompadour, so moving back to the 1740s, 50s, and then going to the court of Louis XV, to Maintenon, so going back to the turn of the century. So we're moving backwards in time rather than forwards in time, but I will definitely take that into advisement. That's a great point. The next question I have in the chat is, was there any backlash against her preferred musical styles and composers? Oh, was there indeed? Yes, we talked about last week with Caroline Weber that, not to use profanity, she was sort of darned if she did, darned if she didn't. And I didn't want to go into this in too much detail because we're talking about politics next week. But just briefly to forecast ahead. So in many respects, when Marie Antoinette simplifies the courtly style, that is seen as an affront to systems of courtly etiquette, that she just doesn't quite know how to behave properly. And indeed, the idea of her theatricality would be woven into scurrilous, libelous pamphlets written about her during the Revolution. She would also certainly be criticized for the huge, I would say that her private pastoral performances at the Petit Trianon did not go over particularly well. She might have thought that she was in dressing as a peasant on a stage in this, nesting doll situation of pastoral illusions, that she was representing some kind of engagement with her rural dependents, when this was very much interpreted as a sign of detachment from those problems, or a shifting of those problems into this illusory realm of the theater. Most of all, I would say that these criticisms, she elicited criticism for being too foreign. This was another thing we talked about in our last meeting that she was seen as a living symbol of this alliance between Austria and France that wasn't particularly appreciated by many people, by lots of people politically. They are suspicious that she might still have allegiances to her brother or her mother in Austria, and by supporting composers that they also liked, that arises, that creates quite a few frictions for her. Karen asks, when did Marie Antoinette's reputation for being frivolous arise? So certainly we also have other historians present who could chime in on that question. So they arise not necessarily from outside of the court, but often first round, like within the court, very connected with her. So it's people who are, say, annoyed at being excluded from this particular realm of leisure that she creates, who begin to spread these rumors about her or begin to publish these secretive pamphlets about her. So she has a brief honeymoon period when she first gets to Versailles, but then these criticisms begin to hound her quite quickly, peaking, of course, with the diamond necklace affair in the 80s, and then really intensifying in the early revolutionary years. And certainly her spending, she was serious about her music, but her spending on musical activities was quite extravagant. So we talked last week about the Count of Artois' shoes and his shoe budget, but the theatrical budget was many times higher than that. So it's not as if she should be completely let off on these charges. Yeah. Maybe one more question. I always like to get out a few minutes early. Oh, I could have played one more music example. Wonderful. Well, in that case, I will bid you all a very pleasant evening. I do hope to see you next what day is today? Next Wednesday. We're going to be talking about Marie Antoinette's musical legacies. I do look forward to seeing you then. And I hope that this has whetted your interest for this festival that's taking place in June, and the events around it are going to be really enriching, really aesthetically pleasing. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you next week.